Дамы и господа, президент Российской Федерации Владимир Владимирович Путин.
Will the real Sergei Sobyanin please stand up? On Monday, June 8th, the Moscow mayor announced what he called a radical weakening of the self-isolation regime imposed to combat COVID-19. The Russian capital would be opening up for business. The digital QR code passes Muscovites needed to leave their homes would be history. And by June 23rd, pretty much everything in the Russian capital, including restaurants, gyms, swimming pools, dentists, and kindergartens, would be fully operating. And oh, by the way, on June 24th, there will be a victory parade to mark the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. And a week after that, on July 1st, there will be a referendum on constitutional changes that would keep Vladimir Putin in power until 2036. Совпадение я не думаю. Russia's mad dash to reopen had little to do with medical data. There are still thousands of COVID-19 cases being reported every day, and Russia's total now tops 500,000 cases. But it has everything to do with the political calendar. And Sobyanin seemed to be on board for the big win. Until at least he wasn't. Just 3 days later, on Thursday, June 11th, Sobyanin urged Muscovites to stay home to avoid mass gatherings, including the Victory Day parade. And at least 12 Russian cities are defying Putin and refusing to hold Victory Day parade. So what's happened, what is happening, and what does it mean? Hello from my makeshift studio in my home in Washington, D.C.'s awesome Adams Morgan district, and welcome to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program at SIPA. And not that I'm keeping track, but we have now been in lockdown for 3 months. This is the 13th podcast we've done from our not-so-splendid isolation. And just for the record, my last haircut was on March 13th. And joining me from his home in Alexandria, Virginia, where they tell me there is an awesome old town, they tell me that he also hasn't had a haircut in a long time, is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome, Don.
Hi, Brian. Yeah, long time.
Long time. You're looking pretty shaggy there, like a hippie. Also joining us from Cleveland, Ohio, where for some reason she is currently hiding, is Maria Snegovaya, a fellow at SIPA's Russia program and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you, Brian. And I didn't get a haircut here, but I did get a manicure. It's the stage 2 opening
good for
in
you.
Ohio.
They're doing manicures in Ohio now. That's nice to know. I hope you were socially distanced when you got your manicure.
Yeah, but by the way, they say they have plenty of visitors from different states now just to make manicure.
So Cleveland is the manicure center of America. Now, so to answer the question I posed in my intro, thanks to a report in Medusa, we know what happened. With Sobyanin. Sobyanin was opposed to easing Moscow's lockdown until cases fell into the hundreds per day, at least as low as in the hundreds per day. They're currently around 2,000 per day in Moscow and about 9,000 per day in Russia as a whole. But then Sobyanin had a little meeting with Putin over the weekend of June 6th and 7th, and the mayor was, let's just say, persuaded to see it Putin's way and to open up Moscow much sooner than he intended, which makes his comments yesterday urging Muscovites to stay away from Putin's beloved Victory Day parade all the more interesting. Maria, I know you've been following this closely. What do you see happening here? We seem to have a split between Putin and one of the most powerful politicians in Russia whose name is not Putin.
Thank you, Brian. And the whole dynamic is extremely interesting and has to do with the fact that Putin is no longer as strong as he used to be. If you look at the his support in electoral data, I hope we get to talk a little bit more in the second part of our podcast. But overall, what you see here is Sobyanin honestly seems to be a little bit like a last man in Russia who takes the whole coronavirus situation seriously. The reason is Sobyanin from the start was extremely concerned with the situation, and also, of course, he's the one whose reputation is gonna suffer and his support is gonna suffer if there is a major outbreak of coronavirus or second wave in Moscow. And honestly, he is making, at least he's relatively consistent. When we look at the data in Moscow, we see that the overall number of cases, daily cases, does not decrease. So originally he wanted to be consistent, but based on actual great work by journalists from Medusa publication, we know that here the interests of regional governors tend to diverge strongly with the interests of the Kremlin. And the Kremlin knows from the existing statistics that the protest propensity has increased sharply in Russia. And the reason is the very dire economic situation in which many Russians find themselves as a result of this lockdown. One of the reasons, of course, is Russians are a relatively poor population. They don't have many savings, and for many, it's just unfeasible to be staying outside of work on so-called vacation for such a long period of time, especially as, and we have discussed it before, the state does not help them. There is no carrots, there is no payments that the state would provide the regular citizens with.
Well, let me interrupt you there, because I haven't come across this at all, but have you seen any evidence that, like, Sobyanin is urging higher payments to Russians if they remain in lockdown? Because it seems to me Sobyanin, yeah, you're right, he's being like the last Russian politician that is actually paying attention to this crisis. But if you're going to have people in lockdown, you got to pay them because people got to live. So is there any evidence on that score?
At least not in the open. It's important to keep in mind that Russia's politics is, bulldogs fighting under the carpet, under famous Churchill's quote, I think. And we just don't hear a lot of those issues indirectly, certain indications maybe. We know, as a matter of fact, that Sobyanin is really against lifting lockdown, is he strictly opposed to that. But as a result of these polls, the Kremlin grows increasingly concerned about the sustainability of the approval for Putin, and most importantly about the destiny of this constitutional vote that's upcoming. So they're worried that if this upcoming soon, and so they're worried if the situation continues, they're just not going to get enough votes that they need for these quote-unquote constitutional changes to be approved. Unfortunately, that's some kind of obsession that Putin has in his mind, and he's not willing to negotiate. So that is sort of explains why Sobyanin's reaction is so hectic. First, he says the lockdown will be in place indefinitely, possibly even until fall. When he hoped originally the constitutional vote will take place. Then he suddenly lifts a lot of restrictions without any warning explanations. Then he urges Muscovites to stay at home no matter what during the parade. So there's a lot of inconsistency there, but the reason is he's been pressured by the presidential administration, by the Kremlin, to comply, while he himself disagree with his policies, and it's very clear.
But what doesn't surprise me is that he was pressured. I mean, that's what Putin does to everybody. And Sobyanin's pretty powerful. He's in Putin's inner circle, but his name ain't Putin, right? So it doesn't surprise me at all that Putin pressured him. What did surprise me was Sobyanin's statement yesterday, where he said, and I'm quoting, "I would not recommend going anywhere on these holidays. Mass events are still banned. Yes, official events will take place on the 12th of June. That's today, which is a Russia Day holiday, which is a holiday in Russia, and on the day of the parade, which is the 24th of June. But it's better to watch it all on television," Sobyanin said. "There shouldn't be any extras or spectators here." That seemed to be a shot across Putin's bow. I mean, maybe I'm reading into this too much. And Don, you and I both remember Moscow in the late 90s, when the beginning of the end of the Yeltsin regime was really that conflict that developed between then Moscow Mayor Yuri Lushkov and then President Boris Yeltsin. I thought there was going to be a war in Tverskaya Ulitsa at some point. Don, I know we're not seeing anything of that magnitude, but is Sobyanin turning into something of the Andrew Cuomo of Russian politics right now?
Well, I'm not.
With all due apologies to Governor Cuomo.
I'm really glad you brought this up. I just thought this was a remarkable week between Sobyanin and the Kremlin or the president's administration. Just a couple of points. Number one, this is not completely pod kavron. This is public. And I think the three of us, for many of those 13 weeks, Brian, have talked about the chances for an opposition. I have no, and I repeat, no intent to say that this is an opposition move, but it's a break in the direction of public concern or public mindedness in a way that we really haven't seen before, at least in a while. And this, I think it's potentially dangerous for the Kremlin, not that Sobyanin would last that long in the elite, but this in a way goes outside the existing rules of the game in a way that I find really interesting, at least partially. It flirts with it. The other point I would make is that this says something about Putin. And, you know, our colleague who's been on your show, Vladimir Frolov, I think it was yesterday, talked about Putin is becoming less the father of the country and more of a niche politician. I think that's overstated, but it does suggest that Sobyanin somehow, brave guy that he might be, feels comfortable clearly signaling dissent from the big guy. And that's a really interesting thing. There's a lot of watching. If his clear opponents in the top, elsewhere in the top, don't try to push him out, which they probably will. But it's just a remarkable two events.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Vladimir Frolov's column, which I also read, and I take what Vladimir writes very, very seriously. In the fact that he wrote those lines, because I think we both know that he's usually very careful. He's very, his analysis of the Kremlin is very spot on, but he's very careful how he presents it. And the fact that he presented it in that way, it certainly caught my attention. And I'm glad it caught yours. I'm beginning
one more point, Brian, on this. Correct me if I'm wrong. I read a lot of Russian stuff this week. There clearly is a split, if informal, in the Kremlin on this between Mishustina and I guess Kirilenko and Putin versus might support Sobyanin. And again, it's the most, I don't want to overstate it, it's the most distinct kind of split we've seen in a while. And I think it's very important.
Well, Sobyanin is no fool, and he's no novice when it comes to the cutthroat world that is Russian politics. And I don't think Sobyanin would have stuck his neck out like he did with his statement yesterday if he didn't have a degree of confidence here, if he didn't smell blood in the water in terms of Putin, if he didn't have support from others in the elite. And there's some really good Kremlinology to do on this, to see, because about where, how things line up. But the other thing to consider is that the mayor of Moscow, I've always considered the second most powerful political post in the Russian Federation. Moscow is a state within a state. It is where the money and the resources of Russia are concentrated, and it's really a state within a state. And Don, you and I, not to harp on our 1990s experience too much, but we saw this then. Now that was a different Russia, and Yeltsin was a different president, and there were different rules of the game. But nevertheless, I mean, the extent to which Lushkov was able to challenge the Kremlin in those days, now that's difficult in this environment, but I think Sobyanin can challenge the Kremlin in ways. I don't think it's an accident that he's the front man here, right? I don't think that's an accident at all.
And even if you and I followed the rise and fall of Lushkov, which was really only 10 years ago, the fall, Lushkov probably had more autonomous financial and political resources behind him. But I haven't looked at Moscow governance lately, but presumably Sobyanin does too, or allies at the top. I just find it a remarkable thing. And again, I would say it's the biggest kind of open split that I can recall since Lushkov's departure, I think. Maria may disagree, but I'm trying to think back about it. The Sobyanin electoral race was really a Sobyanin-Navalny, remember what, 8 years ago was a 6, 7 years, whatever it was, 7 or 8 years ago, was outsider versus an insider. And that makes this particularly unique. And it reminds in a way of Yeltsin, after whom, by the way, the Day of Russia, which is this weekend, was
today. It's today.
Mm-hmm. That Day of Russia was a symbol of Russia's autonomy and strive for autonomy
from the Soviet Union.
Yeah, exactly. So it all sort of comes together in one place.
Well, there's another thing, before I go to Maria, something else I wanted to just throw out there. And it's more of these echoes of the 90s a little bit, but 12 Russian cities are as I mentioned in my intro, are defying Putin in not holding Victory Day parades. Now, we all remember that when Lushkov was opposing Yeltsin back in the 90s, he wasn't alone. He was, of course, together with then Prime Minister Yevgeny Primakov. And this, again, is interesting with Mishustin, who is nowhere near as powerful a prime minister as Primakov was. Or by that point, Primakov was a former prime minister. But he also had, remember, the Otечество Россия, the Fatherland All Russia bloc, was about Russian regional leaders. And here, all right, 12 mayors doesn't make a movement of regional leaders, but it's just interesting in terms of the parallels. Maria, go ahead.
2 points. Yeah, first of all, I wanted to bring up to your attention, as Brian correctly pointed out, is not just strictly a Moscow issue, right? We have 12 regions, apparently, which also in one way or another encourage citizens to be more careful and do not support this complete lift of lockdown. And I think the reason is, is much more fundamental than just, tensions between Sobyanin and the Kremlin more broadly. I think what we observe is actually how weakening of Putin himself and his support is disbalancing the whole structure of power in Russia. In the past, the loyalty of governors and other groups, of course, was based on two factors. First of all, they were appointed by the Kremlin and had no local elites in the regions to rely on usually. Notice how the Kremlin likes appointing outsiders from the region to the position. That's in part because these outsiders actually come without bad rating, because they don't have any enemies in the region and don't have bad reputation, but also, of course, they don't have also any interest groups and coalitions, and so the Kremlin can entirely manipulate them. So Sobyanin would be one perfect example because he's not a Muscovite. He's coming from outside of Moscow. But the very fact that they were connected to the Kremlin already gave these appointees a boost, because when the Kremlin or Putin is popular, every appointee is popular as well. But this situation has changed lately. We know that Putin's approval has been in decline for quite some time, and after coronavirus, the situation has worsened. So Levada had in late April a survey that showed that as of late April, president approval was below that of the cumulative approval rating of the Russian governors. That's also a new development, again in line with the overall erosion of the approval for Putin. In late April, 59% trusted him, as opposed to 61% to the governors.
Maria, if I can interrupt for a second, do you have any numbers on Sobyanin?
Then specifically, I'd have to look. Yeah,
because I'd be curious about that number too. But go ahead, continue. I'm sorry. Just wanted to get...
No, the point being is that the very fact that governors are rating stronger than Putin in the eyes of the Russian population give them a little bit more discretion to disagree with what the Kremlin tells them to do. This is a very interesting feature of the Russian autocracy, which is not entirely purely based on one man's will. It's also dependent on the popular support, at least somewhat. And in this situation, I think the fact that the governors tend to disagree and not to comply with the Kremlin ruling has to do precisely with the fact that they are actually more popular these days than Putin himself is.
If I could add,
go ahead, John.
Which is, I guess, not, I don't want to preempt the show discussion, but the oil spill this week also showed a governor not entirely at home or comfortable with the Moscow influences, in this case, the companies involved. So they seem emboldened, at a minimum, to be more outspoken. And I would think that a governor who's upset about an oil spill in Norilsk would have, Maria, I know you agree, some level of popular support. And I forgot, you just described it in an interesting way. Some popular support, it does play a role, and I thought that was another interesting drama this week, which I think didn't get enough press coverage in the West, at least.
Yeah, I was debating whether to bring in the Norilsk oil spill into this discussion. I was afraid it would bring in too many elements, but you're right, Don. It is relevant here. Maria, is there something you wanted to add there?
I just wanted to add that thanks to this, I was setting. I had a chance to check Sobyanin's approval, and again 61% at the beginning of May, as opposed
so higher than Putin.
A little bit,
Slightly.
and still relatively positive, Right now I'm looking at the poll of late May. Here we've got about very high, actually very high approval of Sobyanin, but here unfortunately they don't have a comparison to Putin himself.
Well, the other thing to bear in mind about Sobyanin is he's not appointed. He was actually elected, elected with scare quotes around it because we're talking about Russia here. But he does actually have, for what passes for a popular mandate in Russia. He won that election against Alexei Navalny, which back in. Was it 2012, if I'm not 2012 or 2013, if I'm not mistaken, which was contested, but he did win it in the first round. This is different from being appointed. Again, gives him a degree of legitimacy that other governors don't have, and legitimacy independent from the Kremlin, aside from the fact that, yes, Moscow is basically a state within a state. There's another thing I wanted to bring into the discussion. This is another thing that kind of caught my attention this week, is before that weekend meeting that Sobyanin and Putin had, when Putin persuaded Sobyanin to see things his way about ending the lockdown, there was a Security Council meeting on June 4th in Moscow. And that Security Council meeting was discussing the rise in protest sentiment in Russia, something I know that you are tracking, Maria, and the Kremlin is certainly tracking, and the Kremlin sees the same trend lines that we see going up. Right. Now, there has been a ongoing debate in the Kremlin. Tatiana Snegovaya referred to it in a piece she wrote this past week, where some in the Kremlin felt the lockdowns were good because the lockdowns made it impossible, of course, for people to protest. Right. But then there were others in the Kremlin who thought the lockdowns were bad because they were effectively pissing everybody off, and everybody's going to be in a sour mood when they go to vote on Putin's constitutional referendums. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, because that Security Council meeting that immediately preceded Putin's meeting with Sobyanin, which immediately preceded Sobyanin's reversal on the lockdown, this all happened right around the same time. And I think they're all different components of the same whole. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
As I mentioned earlier in our previous podcasts, for Russians, one of the key considerations are economic situation rather than this fear of coronavirus per se. And because the economic situation has been worsening tremendously among the Russians, the current situation definitely contributes to the growth of protest propensity. As of now, this Levada Center in early June published these results that show that as of now, the protest propensity is at peak in the last year and a half, and the previous peak happened right after the retirement age increase in summer of 2018. Again, it was a highly unpopular social reform in Russia, which really fundamentally undermined Putin's support. So we see this continuation of this dynamic, and the authorities are growing increasingly concerned about that, as visible by their actions. I also wonder, and that's another interesting question, that this insistence to keep the vote on July 1st for the
I don't understand that.
Exactly. What's the rush? Like, it's pretty bad for Putin right now, but it's probably not as bad as it could be in his imagination, because hence the need to rush the vote. Because again, according to multiple sources, for example, Sobyanin personally hoped that the vote would be postponed till the beginning of the fall, which would make sense. But nonetheless, the Kremlin sees the need to do it right now. And my personal guess is that the economic situation is bad, but partly because of that, Russians right now don't really have time to care about anything else besides making the ends meet. So they need to figure out their personal situation. They need to figure out what they're going to do to go back to work, find another job if your company went bankrupt, things like that. But by fall, they will probably resolve most of these issues, or at least there will be certain balance, certain plateau. And this is where we might expect more protests to emerge. This is one possibility why they couldn't, they think it's dangerous to wait up until fall. But it sort of shows us how bad the situation is, and the Kremlin knows it.
Yeah, no, it seems to me that Putin wants it to be springtime in Russia, and he wants to have his referendum and stick with his old playbook. And coronavirus be damned. And as I wrote in my column for SIPA this week, I can't help but wonder if his political strategists are giving him bad advice right now. I'm not sure if this is Kiriyenko's baby. I'm not sure who's behind this right now. My guess would be Kiriyenko. But it just seems like somebody is giving him bad advice, and he's making what could be a very, very, very costly political mistake. And I want to talk a bit about all of that more in the second half when we talk about the numbers and the data and all those things that make Maria smile. So I'm done. Any thoughts before we move into the second?
Well, I was going to mention Patrushev, always interesting, his interview this week. But I wanted to say that, a year ago, I think on this show, Brian, you and I talked about the unlikelihood that Putin would win an open election in Moscow. I think there's no doubt now that he probably would not.
No, in Moscow, I think Moscow is lost. I think Moscow is lost.
And even last time this came up, it was he had 35 and they cooked it up to 45, 50. But I think there's no doubt Moscow is lost.
And I also saw Patrushev's speech. I was considering playing with that as a topic, but I guess there's always next week. So on that note, we'll shift gears in a few moments. We will continue our discussion and look at the precarious position the Putin regime appears to be in with the Russian public. Is this another false alarm, or is this time really different? I'd like to remind you are listening to the Power Vertical podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. Joining me from his home in Virginia, where, yes, Virginia, there really is an awesome old town, is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow here at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Also joining us from Cleveland, Ohio, where she is currently hiding for some reason, is Maria Snegovaya, a fellow at SIPA's Russia program and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. I'd also like to remind you could subscribe to the Power Vertical podcast on iTunes. You could read the Power Vertical blog and watch the Vertical video at sipa.org, and you could follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. So with his determination to go ahead with this constitutional referendum on July 1st, coronavirus be damned, Putin appears to be sticking to his political playbook. He seems just stubbornly refusing to make any adjustments in this. And I just can't help but wonder, as I noted at the end of the first half, are his political strategists miscalculating? In a recent commentary, EurasiaNet's editor, Justin Burke, wrote the following, quote, "Many Russians, it turns out, viewed the social contract as an insurance policy. In giving the government unchecked power, many believed officials would protect the population economically in the event of the unexpected. With COVID-19 now causing untold damage to the domestic economy, as elsewhere around the world, many Russians now want to file a claim. But they are discovering that their insurer, namely the Kremlin, made some poor investment choices and is now hard-pressed to deliver on its guarantees." Maria, you co-authored an article in Foreign Policy this week with Denis Volkov and Stepan Goncharov of the Levada Center, in which I quoted in my column in for SIPA this week, where you put the COVID crisis in the context of previous crises the Kremlin faced following the 2008 financial collapse and the imposition of sanctions by the West in 2014. And you correctly noted that unlike in those other crises, when Putin's popularity was high and in many cases rising, in contrast to this, prior to the COVID crisis, I'm quoting you now, support for Putin had already been in decline for several years in a row following an unpopular increase in the retirement age and 5 years of decline in real disposable incomes. The Kremlin's handling of the pandemic has accelerated and compounded these trends. And yet, as I said, the Kremlin is stubbornly sticking to its old playbook. Maria, how bad can this go, and have they indeed miscalculated?
Yeah, thank you very much. Brian, in our column, we really draw attention to the fact that this time is different. So the biggest challenge as of now that Putin's regime has faced, as you correctly also mentioned, was 2008 crisis, which sort of crushed the one key indicator in Russia's political system that actually helps us explain a lot of other dynamics of other political indices, which is Russians' assessment of the economy, and especially the consumer sentiment index. The consumer sentiment index is a really important index in Russia, which strongly correlated to a lot of ratings of the Russian authorities. In 2008, you would think not much has happened, so the government managed the crisis relatively well.
But Medvedev was elected president in Putin's little castling move, right?
Yeah, although what happened is that the crisis sort of undermined the legitimacy of the regime and eventually translated into 2011
protests. Exactly.
Protests. So a lot of analysts who look at the protests as being totally isolated from the economic agenda, but if you trace the approval for president for Medvedev and Putin around that time, you see that the erosion of their support actually follows the crisis. So the economic assessments were there as well. However, at the time, the regime was still relatively young, and there was still this contract of well-being in exchange for essentially our votes. So at the time, the regime managed, even if you remember, it had to implement an unprecedentedly high traditionalist campaign, anti-LGBT, anti-pluralism.
Starting in 2012.
Starting in 2012, precisely with Putin's election, and continue into Crimea. Since then, they actually have been able to restore the approval for the regime, but the effect has been eroding, and already by the end of 2017 we saw the approval, the regime approval, the Putin's approval, essentially coming back to what it used to be, to its pre-Crimean levels. Then, as you have discussed, there were several major blows to the approval, and it kept eroding since then. What is different this time is that, yes, exactly, we see that the dynamic of the decline in support for Putin has been already going on for years. As we have discussed early on at the start of this pandemic, coronavirus didn't necessarily create new challenges as much as it accelerated the trends that were already in place, like if you look at the United States, for example.
And exacerbated, probably.
Exacerbates and accelerates them. And in the Russian case, we see precisely the trend that was already there in place keeps worsening. It's really unclear, honestly, to us at this point, even to my Levada colleagues that are always cautious. It's very unclear how Putin is planning to win in 2024, given how unpopular he becomes.
I don't rule out he could lose this referendum. I mean, if unless they really, I don't. This is really uncharted territory. But go ahead.
No, you're right. Although, unfortunately for this referendum, the problem is, again, the problem of Russia's sustainability in Russia's regime is not because there's so many people who support the Putin. It's just that so many people who do not support him don't bother coming to electoral precincts and show that, because they think that the elections are rigged by definition, they're not going to make any difference and things like that. And as of now, unfortunately, the Russian opposition again is divided as to the best way to handle this quote-unquote referendum, which is not really referendum or plebiscite or anything really, honestly, because the constitution is already sort of approved.
I don't think it's possible to say the words Russian opposition without following it by divided.
Yeah, I know, and it's honestly, it's getting so old to having the same old debate every time. This time, though,
Since
the
the 19th
deniers.
century.
Precisely, pretty much. At this point, at least they have some reason, since the way this is all organized, there will hardly be any observers, and people will be ahead of this vote on the electoral precincts. The members of the electoral commissions will have to go around, people visiting there at the houses. So what it means, distance voting, voting by internet, all of those in the Russian context are huge opportunities for the authorities to rig votes. So there is some reason behind the argument.
Lilia Shevtsova had a post on Facebook this week that I found was pretty interesting, where she was saying that actually this is going to harm their legitimacy. Actually, usually elections increase the legitimacy, but this looks so dodgy.
But and the reason it's precisely, and I'm sorry, Brian, precisely, and the reason why it looks so dodgy is precisely the fact that authorities understand how unpopular they are, and so they need to come up all crazy sort of schemes in order to sort of get the necessary number of votes.
Aren't they giving away goodies to people,
exactly,
like 1,000 ruble vouchers that they can?
Exactly, that was exactly my next sentence. The extent that they're now paying people to show. So Putin, remember how again we have been discussing that the Kremlin did not offer Russians any carrots at the start of the pandemic to motivate them to stay at home. Why? Because it was saving the money for later, for when they really need it. Like in the electoral cycle, you want to seduce to buy off the votes of your supporters before the election. You don't want to waste the money ahead of time, because otherwise the effect of you will not be there. So that's exactly what they did. They saved money for when they really needed this money. That is precisely prior to the vote. So here they're going to be giving up the vouchers for 1,000 rubles, which is how many? Will be slightly above $120 probably. It depends on your exchange rate. But it's not enough for us, but for Russians, especially in the regions, especially in the poor regions, which are traditionally a stronghold of Putin's support. That makes a difference. I think a lot of people will come.
One has to wonder, I mean, why they're not dipping into their foreign exchange reserves. I mean, they have more than half a billion US dollars.
Yeah, but they also have up until 2024 to survive, Brian.
Right.
They clearly expect that it's going to get much worse, and we also expect it to get much worse, given how bad it has already become. The trends are very unfavorable to the Kremlin and to Putin, and they, to the extent that Putin, as we write now, Foreign Policy article, actually may increasingly start becoming a liability for the Kremlin elites. This is, again, a very new development, because it's about Putin. For years, we interpreted Putin's regime as essentially being reliant on only one indicator, Putin's approval. Like, Putin was the legitimacy, the whole essence of the regime. It was a personalistic regime which is legitimized by the support for its leader. But we are currently observing the process where it's actually stops being the case. Putin is himself a weakness to the regime. The other institutions within the regime, such as army or the governors,
are more popular.
Are more popular. They are stronger as institutions that Putin as a president is. That is a fundamental change to the regime, and I think it's very important to highlight it.
Yeah, no, Don, this raises something I wanted to. I cannot not address this. I have been accused by various Twitter trolls of like continuously predicting the fall of this regime. I have not been continuously predicting the fall of this regime. I've always been very careful to couch this. I understand how resilient this regime is, but we have over the years at various points seen this regime to appear to be on the ropes, and it comes roaring back. It's just amazingly resilient. Now, Maria makes a very compelling case that this time is different. I sense that this time might be different. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, we have to, I'm sure I'm going to get a bunch of Twitter trolls saying, oh, there he goes again, predicting the fall of the regime, wishful thinking.
Well, why don't, Brian, I'm on your side. Why don't we just stop talking about the regime collapsing, just talking about serious pronounced decline, and we are talking about. We are, and what that means, and I think Maria raises a terrific point about the elite may get sick of him too. Just a couple other points on the discussion here. One is that I think that they are habitually unable to judge grassroots movements very well. They're an isolated bunch of people, and this goes for their
good at it.
What's that?
They used to be good at it.
Well, they were bad at it in Ukraine, and they were bad at it in a number of other places. But I think now they're getting bad at it at home. Second, I very much like and agree with Maria's point that in many ways the Ukraine misadventure was a bump, and now we're seeing a resumption of the decline of the popularity of Putin.
So what started in 2008 is just continuing with that little aberration.
Now, Maria knows the numbers, and it may be more of a rapid decline, but I think we're back to the secular decline. And third, I would note that there may be, I don't know if there'll be any decline in activity overseas, but there's no domestic support for sort of a mobilization agenda. And I think if you look at the numbers from Maria's friends at Levada, there's actually a much significantly higher percentage of Russians who want to be partners with the U.S. and are less malign about it since a year or two ago. And all of this suggests they have to come up with something, and I don't see any sign of them coming up with anything, really.
Yeah, no, I keep remembering, it must have been about a year ago, our common friend Lilia Shevtsova said and when she was here in Washington speaking at the McCain Institute, she said something that's really burned in my brain. She said, everybody understands that this regime is exhausted and on its, and is basically has nothing to offer anymore, but nobody knows what replaces it. And it's that is the only thing that is kind of keeping it going, which I think that is extremely wise words from an extremely wise woman.
And by the way, Brian, this drives, I would suspect, Sobyanin's greater willingness to dissent from the line.
Right. No, I think to circle it all back. There's one other thing I wanted to jump into before we call it a week, another week in captivity. There's something else I wanted to bring in here. I noticed two things jumped out at me also in my trolling of the Russian press this week. One is that the Kremlin, understanding it's lost the cosmopolitan centers of Moscow and Petersburg, are focusing on mobilization on steroids in the regions. Now that's not surprising at all. The second thing was really surprising. And Maria, maybe you could speak to this a little bit. I think it overlaps considerably with your findings and the findings of our friends at Levada. But the Russian sociologist Sergei Belinovsky came out with a report this week that showed Putin losing his rural working class base. Now, if you remember, when he lost the cities, when he lost the kind of middle class in between 2008 and 2012, he basically went all in on this base strategy with it. It was all tied in with this whole traditional values campaign, Orthodox Christianity, anti-Westernism. I don't care about those spoiled pansies in Moscow and Petersburg. I'm going with the real Russian men and the muzhiki in the provinces. It was a clear strategy. We just in the early days of this podcast, I had long discussions with guests about this strategy and its viability. It worked. But what Belinovsky is arguing now, and Belinovsky's a pretty serious sociologist, this report was not based on his own data. He was taking existing data from both Levada and Sion and reached the conclusion that Putin is losing his rural base and is losing his working class base. And if that is the case, this regime is in mortal danger. I mean, really, if that's the case. Maria, your thoughts on that?
We actually see the dynamic on the Levada data, at least the one we tracked, had more to do with the age groups. And in the age groups, it's quite remarkable that anywhere in all the groups below 55, you see that the popularity of Putin has shrunk dramatically. Only pre-retirement population and older actually still preserve certain degree of faith, but it's not again, it does not counter to what Belinovsky finds. It's just a little bit a different way to look at the data. But of course, I mean, first of all, unfortunately, as sociologists disagree a little bit on the approaches used in a lot of the sometimes in Belinovsky studies, because they tend to rely on focus groups that are not very representative. But overall, his conclusions again are in line what we have found, and also it's important to say that he was quite successful in predicting 2011-12 wave of protests 10 years ago.
Yes, he was.
So that's at least one
Famously.
reason to follow what he says. And yes, we do, of course. To me, once again, I would emphasize that in Russia, economy is what matters, and the economic dynamic in the country has been very sad for the last 5 years. And in a lot of ways, a lot of people said, remember when Crimea was annexed and then Russia's Kremlin engaged in the war with Crimea, that it's a short-term gain at the expense of the longer-term
Right.
Possibilities, since given this current situation with the West, the tensions, the sanctions, it's hard for the Kremlin to get any boost for the economy. This definitely now starts to tell. For these traditional supporters, there is regions in more distant regions in Russia. This is what's important. What's important is that the economic well-being grows, and it hasn't been growing. As a matter of fact, before Rosstat revised the the way they estimate the real income dynamics, and they tend to revise everything that does not really comply with their expectations or desires. Before that, the Russian real incomes have been falling for 5 years in a row, disposable real incomes. And this, honestly, that's what you see. The social groups are primarily concerned about the well-being. They're not as worried about civic freedoms or political rights. Political rights and civic freedom is how Putin lost big millionaire cities. And this dynamic actually is now quite demonstrated, revealed in the polls. I have always been telling that Russia's system is a neo-patrimonial system, very similar not to Latin American societies, but actually African societies. And if you look at the dynamic in those systems, again, very often authoritarian, personalistic countries, regimes, they tend to fall after there is a political protest in big cities, and there is economic frustration in the regions, in the distant regions. And if the Russian regime is going to change or follow face some longer-term challenges, this is where it's going to emerge, not just from the relatively still, unfortunately, disrupted position in big cities, but the growing socioeconomic protest and dissatisfaction from the rest of the country that is joined by this core of political activists in big cities. And I think we start witnessing this process. Again, it's not very clear to me how the Kremlin is planning to get out of it. I want to highlight that starting another war is not going to work. That's not what the Russian population wants. It's very clear in the polls. They want peace. They want friendly relationship with the West, and they want continue being the society to continue developing.
Yeah, no, if this Belinovsky analysis is correct, and like you said, Maria, it does kind of coincide with the other data we've been seeing. This is a flashing red warning light for the Kremlin, and I would be remiss if I didn't give a much-deserved hat tip to the great Paul Goebel, my friend and our former colleague down at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, for flagging that Belinovsky study on his blog, which is a must-read blog that I would not have seen it. And I'm very happy that I saw that, because it was a real eye-opening study for me to read. Don, we're pushing up against the end on another week in captivity. Last word goes to you.
No, I would just agree with Maria. I think, isn't he also strong among women still, older women?
Oh, yeah. Older, mostly women, it has been his traditional stronghold. But again, even there we see the erosion of support. It's just not as pronounced in other groups.
But I would add that I expect more ripples on the water like we've seen this week now. That's pretty regular.
We got a lot to keep us busy going forward as this continues. So on that note, we shall wrap it up. That's all we have time for today. Another Friday in captivity. I'd like to remind you, you have been listening to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. Joining me from his home in Alexandria, Virginia, where, yes, Virginia, there really is an awesome old town, has been former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow at SIPA and and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Also joining us from Cleveland, Ohio, where she's hiding for some unknown reason, has been Maria Snegovaya, a fellow with SIPA's Russia program and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. Thank you both for an enlightening discussion.
Thank you, guys.
I'd also like to thank our producer, Mikhail Harmata, for keeping the lights on, all the complicated machines well-oiled, sanitized, and in working order throughout our discussion. I'd also like to remind you can subscribe to the Power Vertical podcast on iTunes. You can read the Power Vertical blog and watch the Vertical video at sipa.org. And you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. Join us again next week. And now, as always, I leave you with the ambient sound mix our producers have created for your enjoyment.